Hello, welcome to our July community call on ORCID in publishing and peer review workflows, presented by the ORCID US Community and ORCID-CA. Your ORCID US and ORCID-CA staff are here with Sheila Rabin, our Senior Strategist for Research Infrastructure Programs at Lyrasis, myself, Paolo Guhildi, the Strategist for ORCID US Community at Lyrasis, and Jan Asler, Manager, Canadian Persistent Identifier Community at Canadian Research Knowledge Network. I'm not going to attempt to speak in French.
Mais je pourrais juste indiquer, juste très brièvement, si vous avez une question en français, je serai très content d'en répondre. If you have any questions in French, please feel free to ask them in French, and then I can do any translation as needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. So for today's call, we will start with an overview of ORCID and the publishing workflow and publishing software platforms with built-in ORCID API integrations. Then we will have a case studies from York University in Canada and Columbia University in the US. Finally, we will have time for Q&A and discussion. So with that, I'll pass it on to John.
Thanks so much, Paolo. Just going to share my screen here. Great. So I'm going to be starting with some big picture overviews, thinking a little bit about ORCID as it fits into the research ecosystem writ large and different kinds of stakeholders and their roles, and then apply that more narrowly to ways that publishers or publishing platforms at different kinds of institutions, how their workflow sort of is anticipated to work as it relates to ORCID. So we'll talk a bit about publishers, maybe the university context. There are lots of journals hosted by universities, and maybe some other stakeholders. And then ultimately, I'll end by talking a little bit about the way that ORCID information is collected and displayed, the sort of anticipated workflow for displaying your ORCID IDs or scholars' ORCID IDs in publications and different things coming out of your journals, as well as just very briefly a little bit about pushing information into ORCID, but I believe that Sheila will cover that in a lot more detail than I will. So this is a big picture diagram that comes from ORCID. It's one that's typically used to talk about interoperability, and it's actually where I typically move toward in presentations rather than start with. But I think it's a really helpful starting place for this discussion to better understand workflows as they relate to ORCID and then narrow it down to publishing. So what you can see here is that there are three kinds of entities surrounding the researcher. ORCID is a research-centered tool. Scholars need to grant permission to different kinds of institutions to interact with their ORCID records in certain ways, especially populating their ORCID records. That is not possible without using the ORCID member API and permission from the scholar. But you can see that this isn't just happening in a vacuum. It's the entire research ecosystem that is engaging within and around the individual with an ORCID record. So just to give you some quick examples of what this might look like, the employer on the right-hand side, that might be a university, that might be a government department, and the role of that particular stakeholder as it relates to ORCID might be to populate a researcher's ORCID record with things like their employment as a faculty member at an institution, or perhaps their degree granting status. Their PhD was indeed granted to them by a given university. At the bottom, we have funders. They might be asserting information about grants and awards that an individual has won. And then on the left-hand side, we, of course, have the publishers. And the goal for the publishers is to push article and peer review, as we'll see later, metadata into ORCID records. But it's more than just each of these stakeholders pushing metadata into someone's ORCID record with their permission. It's all about the ways that the information flows automatically and quickly in and around these different institutions. If you are creating a database of scholarly publications from scholars at your research institution, if you're an employer, for example, you might be pulling all of the publication metadata that exists in someone's ORCID record into your database. And of course, if a publisher pushes a brand new article into that person's ORCID record, then your database might be able to be automatically updated to pull in that new publication. So the information is flowing automatically through ORCID in the center, but between all of these different entities. And it's not just about creating a database internally at a given kind of institution. It's also, of course, about helping scholars more easily reuse the information they have in their ORCID record to significantly reduce administrative burden. If I'm applying for a grant, it would be really great if when I am connecting my ORCID ID to a grant system or a grant application system, it would be really helpful if all of my publications could be pulled into that so that my professional CV, my publication list can easily be a part of that application without me having to constantly rewrite and rekey that same publication list. So of course, if publishers are pushing article metadata into someone's ORCID record, then it's easier for every other part of the research ecosystem, the researcher themselves, to get that information where it needs to go. So that's the big picture and the goal, and this is why this is often used as a slide to highlight interoperability. But the goal here today is to talk a little bit about publishing workflows specifically and the role of publishers and publishing platforms in this process. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but one of the things that's really, really great is that ORCID has developed a series of value stories that highlight the complexity of ORCID as a tool used by many different stakeholders, but specifically focusing on its value for different kinds of entities. There's a value story for researchers, and there's a value story for research institutions, and of course there is one for publishers. So it's important to highlight the different ways that ORCID can be used in this context, in the publishing context, to understand both the role and the value for publishers using and connecting ORCID to their systems. This is an older diagram. It's one that I'm only using because I think it's going to help highlight a little bit of the situation when it relates to specifically the workflow that you can anticipate when you're trying to set something up within your journal or a publishing platform writ large. Sheila will go into detail about the kinds of publishing platforms that have integrated with ORCID and how those work. But I do specifically want to highlight the authentication process and the display process. Again, everything happening here when it comes to getting metadata into a scholar's ORCID record has to start with permission from the scholar. So you're typically going to need some kind of process to ensure that the scholar can easily connect and authenticate their ORCID record, their ORCID ID, to your publication platform, to your journal. So what that looks like is that an individual is going to go through an authentication process using OAuth specifically, and there is going to be somewhere in the journal, in the submission process, in the account registration process, a button that enables someone to register or create or connect an ORCID ID to that platform. It really is just sort of the typical login process. If I go to a journal and I'm registering for an account there, and there is a button that says register or connect your ORCID ID, if I click on that, it will lead me to my sign-in page for ORCID. And in logging into my account, that information will be passed back to the publication platform, authenticating that I am who I say I am, and that the ORCID ID that is collected and attached to my publication or to my account with the journal or the publication platform is correct. But it's not, again, it's not just about an authentication process. It's also about an authorization process to grant permission to the journal, to the publishing platform. Again, if we're talking about universities, this might be your OJS system hosted within your academic library, for example. And so I'm going to authenticate my identity and say, yes, this is me. I have access to this ORCID record. But you're also then, the scholar's also going to see a page like what you see on the right. The institution name will be listed up top, which is currently blank for this example, and they will see certain kinds of permission requests like here, which says add or update your research activities. That is, of course, going to be the article metadata being pushed into someone's ORCID record on their behalf, and also possibly reading your limited access information. In ORCID, scholars can set their information, each individual item, each individual article affiliation, to one of three privacy settings: only me, limited, and everyone. Something that is listed to everyone can always be collected by anyone using even the public API. Something listed as limited is accessible by institutions receiving permission to read limited access information. Why might this be valuable during the registration process or connection process for a journal? Well, one of the pieces of information that is most often set to limited and not set to public is an email address. So if someone's registering and they want to pull in all of their information automatically through their ORCID record, it's nice if one of those pieces of information can be their email address, for example. So the individual is authenticating and then authorizing permission for the journal to modify their ORCID record later if they are successful with the publication of this specific article. This is what this might look like in the wild. So if I'm going to, this is an example of the registration page at OJS. Upon registration for an account in an OJS journal, I might see something like this. When I create or connect my ORCID ID, my given name, my family name, certain other information, my country might be able to be pulled in. So it's automatically filled out. So it's easy for me to register for an account here. And then my ORCID record will be connected to OJS, this specific journal, and I've granted authorization and permission, which will enable the pushing of that article metadata upon publication into my ORCID record. It can also, this is what an authorization page looks like. I was just playing around with the Taylor and Francis submission portal for a specific journal. And this is sort of what that would look like. And you can hit authorize access to enable that platform to push that metadata. And there are other things that are also happening on journal platforms. For example, you can see here that Taylor and Francis have enabled the ability to log in to their platform with ORCID. So once you have connected your ORCID ID to this platform, you can, you don't have to worry about your authorization credentials, your login credentials for Taylor and Francis specifically. You can just log in with ORCID like you would log in with Facebook or Google or something like that. So that's all about authentication. Maybe the last thing I should say is that there are a lot of different places that you can insert the authentication process into your publishing workflow. Like I show on the left here, it could be at the registration phase. So if I'm registering for an account with a journal, that's when I connect my ORCID ID. If I already have an account, there's usually a way to connect it through my profile page in that journal or on that publishing platform. And also, if I am a co-author and I am at no point creating an account in that publication platform, as I'm sure Tomasz will talk about when it comes to the OJS integration, there is an email workflow where I can request my co-authors just via a quick email link to go through the authentication and authorization process without having to create an account in OJS, Taylor and Francis, etc. So after authentication, the next step is ensuring that the metadata of that individual, their ORCID ID, is prominently displayed in the published article, on their profile page with the journal, places that it'll be relevant for scholars who are coming to look at this article to be more easily able to identify and connect to other work by that scholar. So I just want to give you a few examples from my own work, just because it's very easy for me to take screenshots of that. This is an article landing page for an article I published in 2022 with a Taylor and Francis journal. And you can see that on the author list that exists on the landing page, there is the green ORCID ID button displayed next to 2 of the 3 authors' names. The 3rd author did not have an ORCID ID. If someone clicks on that ORCID ID, it should hyperlink directly to that person's ORCID record. So the name John Aspler, the name Aline Bogosian are not necessarily common names, but if my name was John Smith, or if Aline's name was Anne-Marie Tremblay, they might find that there are thousands of people with those names, even possibly in the same research field. So it's helpful to be able to just directly click on that person's ORCID record and be brought to it and find the list of all of their works and affiliations and all of the information about their professional activities. This is what this looks like in an OJS journal. For example, you'll see it's a little bit different. It does actually include the full ORCID ID written out, so I can click directly on that to be brought to my ORCID record or my colleagues' ORCID records. This is a PDF. This is the same as the first article I mentioned. This is the PDF itself. Not all journals will include the ORCID ID directly in the PDF, but this one is being included in this way in this Taylor and Francis journal. And this is where I'll end my section just by saying that after this article was published in OJS, the article metadata was pushed to my ORCID record because I'd authorized it all as I was in the process of doing the submission process. So you can see at the very bottom, there's a green check mark that says Brock University Open Journal System, showing that the source of this metadata isn't me. It is this journal system, so it's more legitimate and credible. And it includes a number of other pieces of information, including, you'll see in the contributors section, direct links to the ORCID IDs of my co-authors. So I'll stop my screen share there and pass it over to Sheila to talk about indirect ways. This is a direct way that ORCID IDs are pushed, that article metadata is pushed into ORCID records. I've published on the platform and the platform is pushing it to my ORCID record. Sheila will now talk about indirect ways.
Great, thank you, John. Let me get my slides up. I'm in the notes. Okay, here we go. All right, so let me just dive right in. So once the publisher has each author's authenticated ORCID ID, typically, and as is best practice, these authenticated ORCID IDs will get included in the metadata for the DOIs for each publication. So this is only for publications that are assigning DOIs or digital object identifiers to each article, basically, which most academic journals do, for example. There may be some publishers that aren't assigning DOIs, but for the most part, I think the majority are doing this. So we'll talk about this. Crossref and DataCite are the two main DOI registration agencies that are used, especially in North America, for any type of publication, or in the case of DataCite, other types of outputs too that can get assigned a DOI. So once these ORCID IDs are connected to the publisher, they can be included in the DOI metadata. So I've highlighted within this nice XML here where you would see an ORCID ID being included in DOI metadata for a work, a journal article, etc. So in that case, Crossref and DataCite both have the ability to add works to people's ORCID records if the ORCID IDs are included in the metadata like this. So in order to kind of facilitate that, your authors, your users, anyone with an ORCID record would need to go in, log into their ORCID record and go to the works section. And when they click on the add button, there's an option for search and link. So basically Crossref and DataCite have search and link databases that are connected within ORCID. So when we click on search and link, a whole list of databases come up. Crossref and DataCite are by no means the only ones, but these are the two that really kind of come into play with kind of the mainstream publication workflows, Crossref especially with academic journals, for example. So if, whichever one you want to do, you can do both, but clicking on either Crossref metadata search or DataCite in that search and link list, if you've never clicked on them before, you would get that, again, like an authorization screen. So in this workflow, not only is the author clicking on this authorized access screen to connect their ORCID ID with the publication, but they can do it within their ORCID record so that Crossref and DataCite can have permission to add things to their ORCID record too if their ORCID ID is included in the DOI metadata. So we're going to look at Crossref first, because that's kind of the most common one for, again, these kind of mainstream publishing workflows. So once that connection has been authorized to Crossref, the first step over here with the number 1 is that the author can search for their name. So this would be like searching for any past publications that have a Crossref DOI. And then they would get a list of matches there. And if they find one that actually belongs to them, they can click add to ORCID, and then that work would go into their ORCID record. And that's what number 3 is showing, is an example of a work in somebody's ORCID record added through that search and link wizard. So that search and link wizard for Crossref is for claiming past works. Any future publications that an author puts out where their ORCID ID is in that DOI metadata, they will initially get a message to their ORCID inbox asking for permission for Crossref to go ahead and add that publication to their ORCID record automatically. Once they do that, any future publications will just automatically get added to their ORCID record. And so that's why I'm really highlighting this workflow, is because these Crossref and DataCite will enable auto updates. So anytime you publish with your ORCID ID, it can automatically get added to your ORCID record. So a lot of publishers rely on this workflow through the DOI registration, as opposed to just directly writing the publication to the user's ORCID record through the publisher themselves, which is also possible. For DataCite, once you connect with that search and link wizard, you don't really have to do anything from there. You're just kind of taken to this landing page, but anytime from then on, if your ORCID ID is included in DataCite DOI metadata, it will automatically get added to your ORCID record. So again, that idea of auto updates, where the author doesn't actually have to do anything other than connect with these two databases in their ORCID record once, and then from then on, their publications will automatically get added. For DataCite, there's a different mechanism if you want to search for past works. For that, you have to go to DataCite Commons and sign in, and you sign in using ORCID, and then you search for works and you can claim them to your ORCID record from there. And there's documentation on all of this linked from our agenda and notes document. But in general, writing publications to ORCID, that can be done directly through the publisher too. They don't have to rely on Crossref or DataCite to do that. So if a publisher is not using DOIs, they could just write the publication to the author's ORCID record themselves using the ORCID member API. The same thing for, repositories. Any kind of works can use this workflow. It doesn't have to be an official publication. Like I mentioned, works with DOIs can be added to ORCID through the Crossref or DataCite search and link wizards or auto updates. There's also all the other search and link databases that don't necessarily have the auto updates, but that's where, they have databases full of publications and other works that users can search through and add to their ORCID record. There's also other databases that don't have search and link databases within ORCID. So things like NASA Astrophysics Data System or Hein Online, for example. These are platforms where authors can go to these platforms and claim works to their ORCID record. And then authors can always manually add information to their ORCID record too. So there are lots of different ways that publications can get added to ORCID. The most common way is that Crossref or DataCite search and link and auto update that we just saw. And then you can just note that the source of each entry in ORCID will show you how it was added to that person's ORCID record, because there are so many different ways that publications and other works can get added to ORCID. If the same publication was added to somebody's ORCID record through multiple different sources, they can be grouped together to kind of collapse duplicates into one entry. If there's a DOI present, the matching DOI will automatically do that grouping. And this is just an example from my own ORCID record where I have one work that was added through OpenAir Explorer. I also added it manually myself, and ResCognito added it to my ORCID record for me. And they all had the same DOI, so they were collapsed together. So this kind of shows you what it would look like. And then there's a preferred source on top that I choose which one I want to show on top. Okay. For peer review, so it's also possible for, if you're involved in peer review activity, if the journal that you're reviewing for asks you for your ORCID ID and that means that they're going to add that peer review record to your ORCID record for you. So go ahead and make that connection, and you have to go through that same authentication process that we saw for the publication workflow. The ORCID member API can be used to write peer review activity to reviewers' ORCID records, as long as the publisher has that authenticated ORCID ID. But it can only be added through API. Authors or reviewers cannot manually add peer review activity to their own ORCID record. It has to be done through the API. We'll see an example of this for OJS. OJS has the ability to do this. There are several other platforms, publishing platforms, that allow for this. A note about auto update is that Web of Science Publons will auto update peer review activity as long as you've gone into Web of Science and connected your ORCID ID and have that auto update box checked. So I have some documentation here, and we will share these slides so you'll have access to these links. This is what it looks like in an ORCID record when a peer review entry gets added. It will just have the name of the journal and the fact that this person was a reviewer. It will not say what article was reviewed or any of those kinds of details that would negate the purpose of having kind of like a blind peer review process. So that is what's possible. These are some of the systems that we know of that are integrated with ORCID, with the ORCID API. So Editorial Manager is one of those that allows people to sign in with ORCID. It can collect the ORCID ID for author, co-authors, and reviewers, and will display ORCID IDs with the publication. And it also writes peer review activity to reviewers' ORCID records. And we've got some documentation linked here about how all that works. eJournal Press is another one, same thing, sign in with ORCID, get those ORCID IDs, display the ORCID IDs, and also will write peer review. Janeway is another one that allows you to sign in with ORCID. It does get the author ORCID ID and display ORCID IDs with publications, but as far as I know, it is not writing any peer review or activities to ORCID. Open journal systems and open preprint systems, they work kind of the same. If you're using a certain version or higher, there is a plugin, an ORCID plugin for these. So we've got documentation on that. And we're going to see demos of the integrations in OJS in just a minute. But this one allows you to sign in with ORCID. You can get the ORCID IDs for the author, co-author, and reviewers. It will display the ORCID ID with the publication. And this one actually writes the publication information directly to the author's ORCID record, not necessarily relying on that Crossref or DataCite integration. And it will also write peer review activity to ORCID. Publons, like I mentioned, is another one. You can sign in with ORCID. It collects ORCID IDs, displays those ORCID IDs, and writes researcher ID, but also peer review and publication information. So this is like Publon's Web of Science. And then last but not least, Clarivate Analytics Scholar 1, same thing as the others. I think I wasn't clear on whether the ORCID ID is actually displayed. I believe it is. It was not clear from the documentation, but this one does not write to ORCID. So as you can see, there are several platforms out there that are used by university presses and stuff like that. And they have different degrees of ORCID integration. So some of them will write things to ORCID and then others don't. It just kind of depends on what system you're using. But in all of these cases, especially if you're writing to ORCID, you will need your own ORCID member API keys to turn these integrations on. And we have, like I said, these documentations are listed here and linked so you can look at those. And we're also happy to answer any questions. I know this is kind of just an overview, so there may be more detailed questions. I think with that, we're ready to see some kind of demos or hear these case studies about how this publication workflow works in OJS, and then we'll also see how the peer review workflow is happening in OJS as kind of to give you an idea of this in action. So I will hand it over now to Tomasz to take us through the OJS publication workflow.
Hello, thanks, Sheila. Hi, everyone. My name is Tomasz Morzewski. I am the digital publishing librarian at York University Libraries in Toronto, Canada. And I'm going to walk you through how we've got the ORCID ID plugin for OJS set up and how that works with the author workflows. So if you give me a second, I'm going to share my screen and oops, just give me 1 second here. All right. Oops. Hopefully you can see all that. Sorry, it's been a surprisingly long time since I've had to do a full screen presentation with Zoom, but here we are. Okay. So a little bit about our setup at York University Libraries. We've been using OJS for a long time, since 2005, which I believe is OJS 1. That's far prior to my involvement, far prior to me being either a librarian or at York University Libraries. Right now, we've got content from a total of about 60 journals. I'd say about 24 of them are active. And if anybody else is in the library publishing space, you might know that as if you've got student journals or very niche faculty journals, sometimes there's some variation in their frequency of publishing, and sometimes they go quiet without knowing. Yeah, so we've got about 24 active journals and a lot of archival content, mainly of journals that lived and died as print journals. And then the editors, after the cessation of the journal, had approached our program to finally give them an electronic life and distribution system. So that's a large part of our collection, and that'll be relevant a little bit later. We were fairly early adopters of the ORCID ID plugin. I had worked with John and Maria Maestrowska from University of Toronto Libraries to present, God, I think it was a couple of years ago now, or at least a year and a half ago, to present about the ORCID ID plugin for OJS. And I think it was the first public presentation of its functionality. So we've been using it for, I would say, about 2 years. And so based on that, I am not the editor of a journal, but I am the administrator of the OJS platforms that our journals run on. And I'm also the person to whom problems get escalated. So if you have questions or concerns about how problematic and labor intensive it is, I think I can answer those kinds of questions fairly well. Uptake among our journals has been quite variable depending on a few things. I would say the two biggest variables for uptake are, one, discipline, and then two, whether or not the editors use the submission pipeline in OJS. We still got a few journals that, for quite a variety of reasons, have their editorial and review pipeline taking place outside of OJS, and then they'll use the Quick Submit plugin to input everything into OJS. Those ones don't tend to use the ORCID plugin as much, although that is something that I'm considering revisiting. And I've got some thoughts on how we might do that. We can discuss that later if interested. But just in terms of giving an overview of the kind of uptake we're seeing, I looked at two of our most active journals just to spot check the number of, the proportion of articles that people are taking up and that authors are using the ORCID ID plugin for. One of our journals, its most recent issue, had 38 authors in total throughout all of their articles and book reviews, and 18 of their authors, so just short of half, had authorized an ORCID ID connection. And then another journal, well, we've got 20 out of 20. That's incorrect. It's actually 20 out of, I think, 24 authors total. My apologies, that's a typo. I'll correct that in the slides that are distributed after this. That's a journal in a discipline in healthcare where there's just much more of a disciplinary emphasis on using ORCID IDs. So we are seeing them, and we are seeing them widely used in articles with multiple authors, which to me says that when additional authors and co-authors are added as contributors, and they are not themselves the ones who are adding the uploading the article into OJS, that they're still getting and are able to act on the prompts to connect their ORCID IDs. About versions, I should say that I'm speaking about OJS 3.3.014. We're currently, PKP recently released OJS 3.4, so unfortunately I can't speak to what this process looks like in 3.4 yet. We're working through some other upgrades before we get to OJS 4. But I think this is relevant because 3.3 is the current long-term support build from PKP, and OJS 3 is going to be around and actively supported until they're looking at January 2025. So I hope that helps for context. Oh, and I should, also say that we do have our membership in ORCID is consortial. So I have not done much negotiation with ORCID directly, but I can't remember if it's through the Ontario Council of University Libraries or directly through CRKN that we do have our consortial membership. However, prior to doing anything in OJS, we did have to work through our consortial membership to get both our client ID and our API keys. So the first thing, and presuming here by sharing this screenshot that those of you who are working in OJS have already started working with plugins and are familiar with how this works. The ORCID profile plugin is available in the plugin gallery, which is great because it let you know it needs to be updated. Very simple clicking, don't need to get your IT support involved. And the setup is quite simple. I've taken this screenshot from our sandbox, from our OJS sandbox. So you're seeing that the API is set to the member sandbox. With the dropdown here, I could make it work with the regular member live production version of ORCID. I blocked out our API key and client ID, but each of these you would get through your membership with ORCID ID. And we've set the request log to all so that if there are any output, we'll get all the error messages. I'm deliberately omitting mentioning the email settings. We'll come to that later. The one thing that we do need to do when getting the ORCID plugin to work is that we do need to contact ORCID directly and let them know each redirect URI, effectively the domain of each journal that we've got to enable the plugin to work. We do have all of our instances of OJS are separate instances with separate domains. So that's a bit complicated. This is probably a lot easier if you've got a single install of OJS, but it's really simple. I just email ORCID support and just tell them to add a redirect URI to our account and they'll do that. It's been problem-free for us. Okay, moving on to how you actually connect the ORCID IDs with the author records. There are 3 routes for doing this, one of which I very strongly prefer and would advise you, unless there are compelling reasons not to follow, which is to automatically prompt authors upon manuscript acceptance to connect their ORCID IDs. If you follow this option, there's virtually no editorial or administrative labor burden. However, it is also possible for authors who create their own OJS user accounts through which they submit the articles. It's possible for them to connect an ORCID ID or connect their ORCID account at the OJS account level. And then finally, it's possible when creating a contributor record, and again, that's the OJS language for co-authorship, it's possible when creating a contributor record for a co-author to select a button that's going to prompt those co-authors to connect their ORCID IDs. So let's look at what these look like. To automatically prompt authors upon manuscript acceptance, I'm looking here again at the configuration screen for the ORCID profile plugin. You'll notice that I've got an arrow pointing to email settings, and we've checked a box that says send email to request ORCID authorization from authors when an article is accepted, i.e. sent to copy editing. Strongly advise doing this. If you have this set up, everybody who is added as a contributor with their email address, with a valid email address for them, to a given submission will receive an email inviting them and prompting them to connect their ORCID ID as soon as that article is accepted in the editorial decisions and it moves to the copy editing phase. John showed you briefly what that email looks like. I'm going to come back to it later after because that email does show up at the end of a few of these processes. But I just want to say that my overall recommendation is if they're at all possible, use this option. It's absolutely painless and relatively problem-free. But for the sake of completeness, I should say that it is also possible for authors who are creating their own OJS user accounts to connect their ORCID ID prior to submitting any articles in the user account profile. Under the public tab, we'll see a button that says create or connect your ORCID ID. If you click it, you receive the login prompt that invites you to do that. It was once possible to create an account in OJS by pre-populating your account with information from your ORCID ID. That was possible, or from your ORCID profile. That was possible in previous versions of the plugin. It does not appear to be anymore. I checked on several of our journals, which all have the most updated form of the plugin, no longer possible. And then finally, another way to connect an author, specifically a co-author, is when you're creating the contributor metadata during the article submission process. There's a checkbox at the bottom of the Add Contributor screen that allows the submitter to send email to request ORCID ID or ORCID authorization from contributor, and that will prompt as soon as the record is created an email, or sorry, I think it's as soon as the submission is complete, send out emails asking the authors to preemptively authorize the connection to OJS. But I should say that if you've got the first connection selected, the first option selected, which is the option to automatically prompt people to connect their ORCID IDs upon article submission, the second and third stages are unnecessary. I've got no reason to believe after a couple of years now that there is any conflict between having that automatic setup and any of the manual prompts that I've just shown. Oh, and in case anyone is interested, I should know, because I see chat notification bubbles, but I haven't read them. In case anyone is curious, we've got quite a few plugins set up almost exclusively from the ORCID plugin gallery. These include ones that can be a little bit trickier sometimes, like the Crossref DOI plugin and the authenticate plagiarism detection plugin. This plays nicely with both of those. We haven't had any concerns about conflict between the plugins. Now, I mentioned the email prompt that authors receive. So whether you've got the automatic prompt set up upon article acceptance, or if the submitting author adds their co-author and checks that box that asks anyone to send, that checks the box that asks OJS to send the prompt to the co-authors. This is what the email looks like. It's an email template. It's quite clear. There's no manuscript submission. Whoops, sorry. There's no manuscript submission title here. I think that might have been just due to the way I set it up. So there would be some identifying information here, and simply you click a button, and it gives the authors the option to connect their ORCID ID. Something that I think John touched on is that there's no manual entry of ORCID ID. It's all through the plugin, so you don't need to worry about either a submitting author or any authors who are prompted by the system to manually input their full ORCID ID. They can do that through the sign-in prompt, which allows them to do, well, they could sign in using their full ORCID ID, but in the article submission stage, no one is going to be asked to type out the full 16-digit ID. Anytime someone is prompted to connect their ID, they're going to receive a sign-in screen looking like option number 1 here. Once they do sign in to approve the authorization, as appears in number 2 here, they're going to be bounced back to OJS. They're going to see the confirmation screen. And then finally, oops, my apologies again, as you'll see in number 3, even prior to the publication, the editor or the author will be able to edit the contributor record and see that the ORCID ID does appear as authorized and does appear there. Now, what does this look like? At the end of the day, we've got 2 screenshots here. On the left, we're seeing a screenshot from the metadata page of an article in OJS. And in this article, we've got, what is that, 8 authors, 7 of whom have connected their ORCID IDs. And as I had mentioned, we're seeing a lot of uptake among co-authors, which again tells me that the automatic prompt is working quite well. Co-authors are reliably able to add their ORCID IDs. And then on the right side, we're seeing a screenshot from one of the authors. This is the 8th author, showing in the works in their ORCID ID or in their ORCID profile, the bibliographic record, and it says source York Digital Journals. That's my publishing program that appears there. I should mention that there is an intermittent issue. God, I hate to say this publicly when this is being recorded, but it's kind of not my problem. So I don't worry too much about it. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not a deal breaker. But there does seem to be an intermittent issue where sometimes both Crossref, which is the DOI registration agency that we use, and OJS do both push the record to an author's ORCID profile. I do believe the developers are aware of this issue and are looking into it. I also have to say that this is an intermittent issue, and I mean, I don't believe this is a deal breaker for anyone. It might be a pain for anybody doing institutional analysis of research impact and research output via ORCID API, but I mean, they likely have to do other cleaning anyway. So I'm not too concerned about this. In terms of other issues that we've required, I've had to deal with, very minimal, very few issues, very few problems. Nothing I haven't been able to resolve. I'd say I've had about 2 problems where something just acted bunny, and I told the editors to like delete the contributor record and recreate it, and that solved any ORCID ID problems. So really quickly summarizing, configuring the plugin to prompt authors of accepted manuscripts is by far the best way to go with this, and I would advise you, where possible, to follow this. I would say that over 2 years of fairly wide uptake among our journals, the plugin has been almost entirely hassle-free. The only thing that, if I could change anything about it, is that the plugin only pushes the record to an ORCID profile when OJS publishes the issue, publishes the article via publishing an issue. It would be nice if an ORCID connection that was authorized after publication could also push, but that's not a big worry. That was sort of me looking for anything bad to say about this. So really, I've got to say, works well. No complaints from me. I'll be happy to handle any questions after this, but for now, I'm going to stop my share and turn it over.
Thanks, Tomasz. So now we're going to hear from Jeremiah about the peer review aspect in OJS. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Thanks, everyone. And let me just get my screen set up here and go ahead and get play here. So I want to, so I'm Jeremiah Mercurio. I'm the interim director of digital scholarship at Columbia for a bit more than 3 years now, and also the head of humanities and history. I'm really stepping in today for some of my colleagues, particularly Esther Jackson and Michelle Wilson. Michelle really instigated our use of the plugin for peer review credit. She's now at the University of Maryland Libraries in a nice role for her. So I say that in part to give them the credit for instigating this at Columbia, but also to say that I may not have as much granular detail about this as they would. So I'd be happy to kind of also forward any questions that I'm not able to answer directly. But just a little bit of background on our publishing program here. We've been active in publishing the journal publishing program since 2007 at Columbia. We have about 35 active journals now, some retired journals, not a whole lot. But we also have a podcasting partnership program and other things that the publishing program helps to facilitate. So I'm going to just talk about OJS today, obviously. So focusing on that. We have, a lot of student-led journals, some of them coming out of grad programs, a number of undergraduate journals, some faculty-led journals as well. The 2 examples where we're using the peer review plugin are student undergraduate journals. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. We're currently on OJS 3.3. 0.010, haven't upgraded to 3.4 yet, but so anything I say is related to that. Tomasz did a nice job of talking through some of the setup. So some of this will be just kind of review of the process. So we obviously went through the plugin gallery and added our ORCID profile plugin here. Fairly easy to set up. A couple of things you just have to make sure in terms of that you filled out to make sure that it's reading to the ORCID profile of the contributors, the city, state, of course. We did not, because we were kind of testing this out on a sample journal site, we did not actually have the online ISSN of the journal associated, but we added it. So we had a little bit of hiccup in getting it set up, not realizing at first that that was causing the problem, but if you're filling out all your journal information directly here. And I should add that the journal editors are managing their own individual journal sites with support from the digital scholarship team, but they're doing a lot of this work themselves. So I'll talk a little bit about adding reviewers. So this is, we're looking at the kind of submissions portal here. And once you have something added to your submissions queue as a journal editor, you can go in and start to add your reviewers, as many of you might know. And if you're creating a new reviewer, if someone hasn't reviewed for your journal already, obviously you're going to fill out their new information. And there's a section at the bottom with using the email template to request the review. This is a good place. We haven't done this yet with this template to add the reminder about OJS and the ORCID integration. But in this form, you'll also see that it's a place where you can select the review type. And that actually has an impact on what shows up in terms of the metadata on an individual's ORCID profile. So I'll circle back to that toward the end to show you a couple of examples of that. But obviously, we're doing a lot of our journals are double-blind peer review, but there are a few, I think, who have an interest in open peer review. Anyway, so as a reviewer, this is probably review for a lot of you, but as a reviewer, you'll get these messages, and if you're new to OJS, you'll get the registration email as well. And this is really so we get the article review request and the registration email. And then as you go to OJS to start to fill out your information, here's where we're going to authenticate our ORCID ID or create a new ORCID ID to add to our profile. At Columbia, and I can talk a little bit more about this later if there's interest, but we're actually going to implement ORCID two-factor authentication for all OJS accounts as an additional security measure coming up next month. So this will not be optional for contributors relatively soon, but it is at the moment. So here in your, as a reviewer, if you're logging into OJS in your profile, if you go to the public tab, this is where you can authenticate, of course. We've seen some examples of this already. And this is where you can authorize OJS to associate your ORCID ID, and then you will see it there in the bottom of that profile showing up once you have done that. So if you're adding a reviewer now and they've already associated their ORCID ID, you can see that the ORCID ID is prominently displayed there, and as you're selecting the reviewer, you can be reminded of whether or not they've done that. So this is looking at a little bit after the review has already been submitted. We're seeing, if you look at the last line there, we're seeing an option if you're the journal editor to thank the reviewer. So the first thing you'll see is the option to review, to read the review. But once you've accepted that review, then you'll start to see the option to thank the reviewer. And this is, and also you'll get the email template that'll come up to thank the reviewer. But once you're using the member API, then sending that thank you writes the credit for the review to the public profile. These were the sort of samples that I was using for myself. So this is a look at my own ORCID profile here. And you'll see they're coming from the same journal we're using for the sample here. But the bottom one is kind of a typical example where we're seeing the some very basic information, as Sheila described too, with just the type of activity, the review, and the date. And this whole peer review section only shows up once you, through the member API once you have a review in your profile. So it won't show up there otherwise, and you won't be able to add it until it is there. We're seeing the source is Columbia University Libraries Journals, but in the top of these two reviews, we're seeing a bit more information because that was the one where open review was selected by the journal editor. So we get a little bit more information about that work. And this is actually a review, a set of reviews from a real peer reviewer on one of our journal partners sites, the Journal of Global Health. So it is being implemented. We have really only 2 of our journals, both undergraduate journals, as I said, are employing it now. And their primary motivation in employing it was to offer an enticement to reviewers. They were having trouble getting the number of peer reviewers that they needed. So this was sort of an experiment on these journals' part to entice more reviewers to participate. And it has had some effect. So I think in terms of kind of where we're going with this, one is just kind of further promotion of this as an option for our journal partners, and to talk more with the journals who have implemented this to get more feedback on their experience, kind of what they're looking for, what they'd like to see in the future for this, and just, you know, what they're hearing from the peer reviewers in terms of the value of this credit. In terms of kind of questions that we have, you know, a lot of the journal partners have asked about kind of giving retrospective credit for reviewers since they're just implementing this now. And there are a couple of potential workarounds for that. We're going to talk more, I think, with reviewers directly, as I said. And as at Columbia, as we integrate ORCID more in the scholarly workflows, through a planned integration with our institutional repository and through the 2-factor authentication project that I mentioned, I'm hoping we'll see sort of an uptick and we'll track the usage of that moving forward. So that's basically it, but happy to answer any questions that come up.
Great, thank you, Jeremiah, and also thank you, Tomasz, for your sharing your case studies with us. We are at the hour, so if anyone does have to take off, that's fine. We're going to continue recording. Anyone who is available to stay on, please feel free to do so, and we can have a little bit of further discussion. I know there was a lot of kind of questions and confusion about the Crossref and DataCite search and link and auto updates in the chat, so we can talk more about that, or if anyone has additional questions. I will make it so that anyone can unmute themselves and or start your video if you'd like to unmute and ask a question or make a comment, or feel free to do that in the chat. I think all the questions that were asked in the chat were answered, but if not, let us know and we can address them. I will just take this moment to say, as far as auto updates go, Crossref, DataCite, and Web of Science are the only platforms that will automatically update somebody's ORCID record once they get permission. The way to enable those auto updates is different for each of those platforms, but those are the only three in like the works section that will do those auto updates. Everything else, the user has to go in periodically and claim works. Unless the publisher is just adding the works directly. Email address, absolutely. If you are, yeah, thank you, John. We have both members from the United States and from Canada on the call today, so you can contact your respective consortia lead depending on where you are coming from, and we are more than happy to work with you one-on-one. And that is why we are here. This is our thank you slide with our email addresses on it. And my cat saying hello. Any questions, comments? This was definitely a lot of information. So yes, it is definitely a lot to digest. But if anyone thinks of questions or comes across anything as you go forward, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can point you in the direction of where you need to go. Okay. With that, assuming there are no questions at this time, I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and a special thank you again to Tomasz and Jeremiah for volunteering their time to share their case studies with us. Stay tuned for this recording, and slides will be shared as well. And we will see you all next time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.